The night sky over Hamburg erupted in streams of tracer fire as Obergefreiter Ernst Becker pressed his eye against the sight of his 88mm Flak gun. It was July 28, 1943, and the second night of what the British were calling Operation Gomorrah. But Becker's battery wasn't concerned with the RAF bombers that had devastated the city the night before. His crew was tracking something far more troubling. American B-17 flying fortresses, arriving in broad daylight, flying in tight formation at 23,000 feet. Through the haze of smoke still rising from the previous night's fires, Becker watched his tracer rounds arc toward the bomber stream. He saw the flashes. He counted the hits. One B-17 took a direct hit near the No. 3 engine, then another shell burst directly beneath the fuselage, then another struck the tail section. Becker's crew had been trained on the 88mm gun at Luftwaffe anti-aircraft school in Doberitz. They knew the specifications by heart. Each shell contained nearly 10 kilograms of high explosive. The fragmentation pattern could shred aircraft aluminum like paper. A single direct hit should be catastrophic. 2 or 3 hits should guarantee destruction. But the bomber kept flying. It didn't fall. It didn't even leave formation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Becker's hands trembled slightly as he tracked another fortress. His loader, Gefreiter Hans Müller, was already ramming another round into the breach. They had fired 68 rounds that morning. Becker had personally observed at least 14 impacts on various B-17 seconds. According to everything they had been taught, half those aircraft should be scattered across the Hamburg suburbs. Instead, the formation pressed on toward the industrial districts along the Elbe, their bomb bay doors opening with mechanical precision. What Becker couldn't have known, crouched behind his gun emplacement with smoke stinging his eyes, was that he was witnessing the result of a fundamental difference in aircraft design philosophy. The Americans hadn't just built a bomber. They had built a bomber system engineered specifically to absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft in the world. Every rivet, every structural member, every redundant system had been designed with one purpose: bring the crew home. The story of why the B-17 could sustain this seemingly impossible level of damage began years before in Seattle, where Boeing engineers faced a challenge that would define modern aviation warfare. When the Army Air Corps issued its specification for a long-range bomber in 1934, they weren't just asking for a larger aircraft. They were asking for something that had never existed: a bomber that could fight its way deep into enemy territory, deliver its payload, and return despite everything the enemy could throw at it. Boeing's chief engineer, E. Gifford Emery, understood that the traditional approach to bomber design wouldn't work. European bombers like the German Heinkel, He-111, or the British Armstrong Whitworth Whitley were built on the assumption that fighters would provide protection, or that night would provide concealment. But the American doctrine demanded daylight precision bombing without fighter escort for most of the war. That meant the bomber had to protect itself. The solution wasn't just heavier armor or more guns, though the B-17 would eventually carry both. The solution was redundancy engineered into every critical system. The control cables, for instance, weren't routed through a single channel like conventional aircraft. They were duplicated, triplicated in some cases, running through different sections of the fuselage, so that damage to one area wouldn't sever all control authority. The hydraulic systems followed the same principle. While most aircraft of the era used a single hydraulic system for landing gear, flaps, and bomb bay doors, the B-17 employed multiple independent systems. If one failed, others could compensate. The landing gear could be manually cranked down if all hydraulics failed. The bomb bay doors had explosive release mechanisms as a final backup. But it was the structural design that truly set the B-17 apart. Traditional aircraft construction used aluminum skin as a stressed member of the structure. Damage to the skin compromised structural integrity. Boeing engineers instead used a robust internal framework of formers and stringers that carried the primary loads. The skin was important, but not critical. A B-17 could lose entire sections of skin and still maintain structural integrity. This philosophy extended to the engines. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines were mounted on flexible mounts that could absorb tremendous vibration and even light battle damage without transmitting destructive forces to the wing structure. Each engine had its own independent fuel system, oil system, and electrical generation capability. The failure of one engine, or even two, didn't doom the aircraft. Back over Hamburg, Obergefreiter Becker was learning these lessons the hard way. His battery commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, stood beside the rangefinder, his face growing increasingly pale as he watched the bomber stream continue unimpeded. Weber had served in the Flak since 1939. He had shot down Polish bombers over Warsaw, French bombers over the Maginot Line, and British bombers over the Ruhr. He knew what aircraft destruction looked like. This wasn't it. Weber grabbed the field telephone, connecting him to the battery fire control center. "We're getting solid hits," he reported, frustration creeping into his voice. "Multiple impacts per aircraft. They're not going down." The voice on the other end confirmed what Weber was seeing. Across all 6 Flak batteries defending Hamburg's industrial sector, gunners were reporting the same phenomenon: high hit rates, clear impacts, minimal bomber losses. The 88mm Flak gun, officially designated the 8.8 cm Flak 183637, was the finest anti-aircraft weapon in the world. Its development had begun in secret during the 1920s, when Germany was still restricted by the Treaty of Versailles. By 1943, it had evolved into a weapon of devastating effectiveness, equally capable against aircraft or ground targets. The gun could fire a 15-kilogram shell to an altitude of 32,000 feet. At the bomber's altitude of 23,000 feet, the shells arrived with tremendous kinetic energy and explosive force. The proximity-fused shells, when they functioned correctly, would detonate within lethal radius of the target aircraft. Direct hits were catastrophic against every aircraft the Germans had encountered. Soviet bombers disintegrated, British Lancasters broke apart, even the heavily built Short. Sterling couldn't survive multiple 88mm impacts. Except the B-17 did survive. And it kept surviving, mission after mission, despite hit rates that should have been lethal. Unteroffizier Karl Schneider, manning the predictor site at Battery Position 7, had developed a system for tracking his hits. He marked each confirmed impact with a small notation in his logbook: date, time, target identification, observed result. By the end of July 1943, his logbook recorded 47 confirmed hits on B-17 seconds. Of those 47 impacts, exactly 3 had resulted in confirmed kills. 3 out of 47. The mathematics made no sense. Against RAF bombers, Schneider's hit-to-kill ratio had been approximately 1 in 4. Against the Americans, it was 1 in 16. Either American aircraft were fundamentally different, or American crews possessed supernatural resistance to high explosive fragmentation. Since the latter seemed unlikely, Schneider began studying the Americans' aircraft with obsessive detail. What he discovered, pieced together from gun camera footage and direct observation, was that the B-17 seconds were absorbing damage that should have been catastrophic. He documented one fortress that had taken 5 confirmed hits, 2 in the fuselage, 1 in the wing root, 1 in the tail section, 1 in the number 4 engine. The aircraft had maintained formation, dropped its bombs on target, and returned to England. 5 hits. Any 5 hits would have downed Halifax. 3 hits would have killed Wellington. The Sterling wouldn't have survived 2. But the B-17 flew on, its propellers still turning, its formation position maintained with mechanical precision. The answer lay in the Boeing plant in Seattle, where engineers had created something unprecedented in aircraft design, a damage-tolerant structure. Traditional aircraft were designed to survive normal flight loads with appropriate safety factors. The B-17 was designed to survive battle damage, with multiple systems failed and significant structural compromise. The wing structure exemplified this philosophy. The main spar, which carried the primary bending loads, was a massive I-beam that ran continuously from wingtip to wingtip through the fuselage. This single structure could carry the entire weight of the aircraft, even if every other structural member was damaged. Secondary spars provided redundancy. The ribs were closely spaced and heavily reinforced. The entire structure was overbuilt by conventional standards, trading weight efficiency for survivability. A typical German or British bomber might use 4 main attachment points to join the wing to the fuselage. The B-17 used 9, distributing loads across multiple structural paths. If battle damage destroyed several attachment points, the remaining points could carry the load. This redundancy extended throughout the aircraft. There wasn't a single point of failure that would bring down a B-17, short of catastrophic damage to the main spar itself. The fuel system demonstrated the same obsessive attention to survivability. The B-17G model carried fuel in 9 separate tanks, 4 in each wing, 1 in the fuselage. Each tank was self-sealing, using a synthetic rubber compound that would swell when exposed to fuel, automatically plugging bullet holes and shell fragments. The fuel lines were protected by armor and routed through the safest possible paths. Fuel valves allowed the crew to isolate damaged tanks and transfer fuel between undamaged ones. When a German 88mm shell fragment punctured a B-17 fuel tank, the self-sealing compound would activate within seconds. Fuel loss was minimized, fire risk was reduced, the bomber flew on. This was technology the Luftwaffe had experimented with but never fully implemented due to weight and complexity concerns. The Americans accepted the weight penalty because they understood that a bomber that returned damaged was infinitely more valuable than a bomber that didn't return at all. Over Hamburg, the bombing continued. Hauptmann Weber's battery had exhausted its ready ammunition. Crews were hauling shells up from the underground magazines, their hands blistered, their uniforms soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. They had fired over 300 rounds. Weber estimated perhaps 60 hits across the bomber formation. The Americans had lost 4 aircraft, 4, against 60 hits from the most effective anti-aircraft gun in the world. The psychological impact on the gun crews was profound. These men had trained extensively on the 88mm. They understood its capabilities. They had seen what it did to aircraft, to tanks, to fortifications. They had confidence in their weapon, in their training, in their ability to defend German airspace. But that confidence was eroding with every B-17 that absorbed multiple hits and continued flying. Gefreiter Müller, still loading shells into Becker's gun with mechanical efficiency, muttered what many were thinking. They must be using different aluminum, stronger metal, something we don't have. It was a comforting explanation. It suggested that American survival was due to superior materials rather than superior design. It preserved the belief that German engineering was still fundamentally sound. But it wasn't true. Metallurgical analysis of captured B-17 components would later show that American aluminum alloys were similar to German alloys, sometimes even slightly inferior in pure strength characteristics. The difference wasn't in the materials, it was in how those materials were used. Boeing engineers had performed something unprecedented. They had systematically tested their aircraft to destruction. Before the first production B-17 ever flew combat, Boeing had subjected test aircraft to simulated battle damage. They fired machine guns at wings. They detonated explosive charges near fuselages. They severed control cables. They disabled engines. They created every failure mode they could imagine, then observed what happened. Each test revealed weaknesses that were corrected in the design. Control cables were rerouted. Structures were reinforced. Systems were duplicated. The B-17 that entered combat in 1942 was the product of thousands of hours of destructive testing, each test making the aircraft marginally more survivable. Those marginal improvements, accumulated across hundreds of design decisions, created an aircraft that could absorb punishment no other bomber could survive. The electrical system illustrated this approach perfectly. Most aircraft of the era used a single generator driven by one engine to power all electrical systems. The B-17 had 4 generators, one on each engine, feeding a common bus. If 3 engines were disabled, the 4th could still provide electrical power for critical systems. The radios, navigation equipment, hydraulic pumps, and turbochargers all had multiple power sources. Even the oxygen system, crucial for high-altitude operations, was designed with redundancy. Rather than a single large tank that could be catastrophically compromised by a single hit, the B-17 used multiple smaller bottles distributed throughout the aircraft. Damage to one section's oxygen supply didn't deprive the entire crew of oxygen. This saved countless lives when German fighters began targeting oxygen systems specifically. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-afternoon on July 28th, the American bombers had departed, leaving Hamburg burning from a combination of RAF incendiaries from the previous night and American high explosives from the morning raid. In the flak positions around the city, exhausted German gun crews sat among empty shell casings, trying to process what they had experienced. Hauptmann Weber assembled his battery commanders for a debriefing. The numbers were stark. Across all defensive positions, German flak batteries had fired approximately 2,700 rounds of 88mm ammunition at the American formation. They had observed roughly 400 confirmed hits based on gun camera footage and direct observation. The Americans had lost 24 bombers to all causes: flak, fighters, and mechanical failure combined. 24 losses from 400 hits represented a kill rate of 6%. For every 100 shells that struck an American bomber, 94 aircraft survived. This was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. Weber drafted a report to Luftwaffe High Command that would be filed away, largely unread, in the chaos of total war. But his conclusions were prescient. The American heavy bombers demonstrate survivability characteristics that exceed all previous aircraft encountered. Current anti-aircraft effectiveness against these targets is insufficient to prevent daylight bombing operations. Fundamental changes in defensive tactics or weapons are required. Those fundamental changes would never come. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to develop and field new anti-aircraft systems while simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts. The 88mm gun, magnificent though it was, represented the peak of German flak capability. It would have to be enough, and increasingly, it wasn't. The B-17's defensive armament also played a crucial role in its survival, though this was secondary to its structural resilience. The bomber bristled with 13 Browning M2, 50-caliber machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire that made fighter attacks costly. But even this armament was designed with redundancy in mind. The guns were belt-fed from large ammunition boxes, not the smaller drum magazines used by German aircraft. If one gun jammed, 10 others continued firing. The turrets themselves were designed to remain functional even after significant damage. The ball turret could retract into the fuselage if damaged. The tail guns had redundant control systems. The top turret was positioned to protect critical areas of the aircraft while remaining operational, even if the bomber was heavily damaged. Every design decision reflected the Boeing philosophy: build systems that continue functioning after damage that would disable other aircraft. In the intelligence sections of Luftwaffe headquarters, analysts were beginning to recognize a troubling pattern. Initial reports from the front had suggested that American bomber losses were high enough to make daylight operations unsustainable. But as data accumulated throughout 1943, a different picture emerged. American loss rates were declining even as defensive measures intensified. The Americans were learning and adapting faster than German defenses could evolve. Each mission revealed tactical improvements: tighter formations for mutual defensive fire, better coordination with fighter escorts when available, improved evasive maneuvers. But underlying everything was the simple fact that the B-17 could survive battle damage that would destroy other bombers. This fundamental advantage in aircraft design was proving insurmountable. Oberst Heinrich Bodenschatz, a Luftwaffe staff officer responsible for analyzing air defense effectiveness, compiled a comprehensive study in September 1943. His report, based on data from 53 major American daylight raids, calculated that German fighters and Flak were inflicting an average of 3.2 major damage incidents per American bomber per mission. Major damage was defined as hits that would normally cause catastrophic failure, engine destruction, major structural damage, fire, or multiple system failures. Yet average bomber losses were running at approximately 6% per mission. The mathematics implied something startling. The average B-17 was surviving more than 50 major damage incidents before being lost to enemy action. Some individual aircraft were surviving hundreds of incidents over multiple missions. The most documented example of B-17 survivability came not from Hamburg, but from a mission 2 months earlier that would become legendary among both American crews and German defenders. On May 14, 1943, a B-17F named All-American of the 97th Bomb Group was returning from a raid on Tunis when it collided with a German Bf-109 fighter at 12,000 feet. The collision was catastrophic. The fighter's propeller and wing sliced completely through the B-17's fuselage just aft of the waist gunner positions, cutting through longerons, formers, and structural members. The tail section remained attached by only 2 narrow strips of metal along the bottom of the fuselage and the control cables running through the severed structure. By conventional engineering analysis, the aircraft should have broken in half immediately. Instead, pilot Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg maintained control. The bomber's main spar, running continuously through the fuselage, had not been severed. The empennage, though barely attached, remained stable due to aerodynamic forces and the structural integrity of those 2 metal strips. Bragg nursed the crippled bomber for 90 miles to an emergency landing at an Allied airfield in North Africa. The aircraft landed successfully. The crew survived. Photographs of the damaged bomber, with its fuselage nearly cut in 2, would circulate through German intelligence channels, causing considerable confusion about American construction methods. What the Germans couldn't understand was that this survivability wasn't accidental. Boeing engineers had specifically analyzed and planned for partial structural failure. The main spar was deliberately designed to carry loads even if surrounding structures were destroyed. The control cables were routed with enough slack and redundancy that even with major fuselage damage, some control authority remained. The design philosophy was simple: assume major damage will occur, then engineer the aircraft to survive it anyway. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to German bomber design. The Heinkel He 111, Germany's primary medium bomber, was a masterpiece of efficient construction. It used the minimum structure necessary to carry operational loads with appropriate safety factors. This made it light, efficient, and cost-effective to produce. But it also meant that any major structural damage was catastrophic. There were no redundant load paths, no overbuilt structures to absorb damage. A single catastrophic hit would bring down a Heinkel. The same was true of the Junkers Ju-88, perhaps the most versatile aircraft Germany produced. It was fast, agile, and capable in multiple roles, but its efficient structure meant poor survivability. British and Soviet gunners learned that solid hits on the Ju-88's wings or fuselage would usually result in catastrophic failure. The aircraft was designed to avoid being hit, not to survive being hit. The Americans took the opposite approach. They accepted that their bombers would be hit, repeatedly and seriously. So they designed aircraft that could be hit and keep flying. This wasn't just a tactical difference. It was a fundamental philosophical divide in how the two nations approached aerial warfare. Back over Germany, as the bombing campaign intensified through late 1943 and into 1944, German Flak crews continued to witness the same frustrating pattern. Obergefreiter Becker, now promoted to Unteroffizier and commanding his own gun, kept meticulous records of his battery's performance. By March 1944, his unit had participated in 47 defensive actions against American heavy bombers. They had fired 7,312 rounds of 88mm ammunition. Based on post-action analysis including gun camera footage, spotter reports, and observed impacts, they had achieved approximately 940 confirmed hits on B-17 seconds and B-24 Liberators. Of those hits, 63 had resulted in confirmed bomber losses that could be attributed to their battery. 63 bombers from 940 hits, a kill ratio of approximately 1 in 15. Becker's battery was considered highly effective, well-trained, and competently led. Their gun sights were properly calibrated. Their ammunition was quality controlled. Their tactics were sound. And still, 14 out of every 15 shells that struck an American bomber failed to bring it down. The ammunition itself became a subject of investigation. German munitions experts examined whether the 88mm shells were detonating properly, whether the fragmentation patterns were optimal, whether proximity fuses were functioning as designed. Tests confirmed that the ammunition was performing exactly as specified. The problem wasn't the shells, it was the targets. Hauptmann Werner Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, commanded a Flak regiment defending the synthetic oil plants at Leuna. His position gave him perhaps the best perspective on American bomber survivability, as the Leuna plants were among the most heavily defended targets in Germany. On May 12, 1944, during a maximum effort raid by the 8th Air Force, Göring's regiment fired over 4,000 rounds at the attacking formation. His after-action report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, described the engagement in detail. The Americans approached in their characteristic formation. Boxes of 18 to 21 bombers, stacked vertically with approximately 500 feet separation, multiple boxes forming a stream several miles long. The density of the formation meant that flak batteries couldn't help but hit something. The challenge was making those hits count. Göring's heavy batteries opened fire at maximum range, putting up a curtain of steel and explosive through which the bombers had to fly. Gun camera footage showed the bombers flying through this barrage, absorbing hit after hit. Göring personally observed one B-17 take 7 confirmed impacts within 30 seconds. The bomber's No. 3 engine caught fire. Chunks of fuselage skin peeled away. The vertical stabilizer showed visible damage. The bomber didn't fall. The crew feathered the damaged engine, extinguishing the fire. They dropped their bombs on the target. They turned for home, maintaining position in formation until they crossed the German border, only then dropping back to allow damaged aircraft to receive maximum fighter protection during the return flight. 7 hits. On any other bomber in the world, 7 88mm hits would be fatal. On a B-17, it was survivable damage requiring extensive repair but not preventing mission completion. This single incident, multiplied across hundreds of missions and thousands of bombers, represented the fundamental challenge facing German air defences. The fire suppression systems on the B-17 deserve particular attention, as they saved countless aircraft that otherwise would have been lost. Early model B-17 seconds had experienced catastrophic fires from fuel leaks and damaged engines. Boeing engineers responded by installing carbon dioxide fire suppression systems in the engine nacelles and fuel tank areas. The CO2 bottles could be activated manually by the crew or automatically by heat sensors. When activated, they would flood the affected area with carbon dioxide, starving fires of oxygen. This simple system prevented many engine fires from spreading to fuel tanks or wing structures. German intelligence noted numerous instances of B-17 seconds flying home with fire-blackened engine nacelles, the fires having been suppressed before they could destroy the aircraft. The hydraulic systems also demonstrated redundancy that German engineers found excessive. A typical B-17 had 3 independent hydraulic systems, one for brakes and landing gear, one for turbochargers and cowl flaps, one for turret operation and bomb bay doors. Loss of one system didn't compromise the others. This meant that even heavily damaged bombers could still lower landing gear, adjust engine power, and defend themselves. Gefreiter Hans Zimmermann, a flak gunner in the defense of Schweinfurt, witnessed the effectiveness of these redundant systems during the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943. His battery scored multiple hits on a B-17 that had already been savaged by fighter attacks. The bomber's entire left wing was shredded, with gaping holes visible even from the ground. One engine was completely gone, torn from its mounts. The vertical stabilizer was nearly shot away. By all conventional understanding, this aircraft should have been uncontrollable. The asymmetric lift from the damaged wing, the loss of directional stability from the destroyed tail surfaces, the loss of power from the missing engine, all should have put the bomber into an unrecoverable spin. Instead, the pilot maintained control through some combination of skill and aircraft design that Zimmermann couldn't comprehend. The bomber crew jettisoned everything loose: ammunition, guns, equipment, anything to reduce weight. They trimmed the aircraft to compensate for the asymmetric lift. They used throttle control on the remaining engines to maintain directional stability. And incredibly, they nursed the crippled bomber back across Germany, across France, and ditched successfully in the English Channel, where British air-sea rescue launches picked them up. Zimmermann included this observation in his report. The American bomber absorbed damage that would have destroyed 3 German aircraft. Their survival was not luck. Their aircraft are designed to be destroyed and still function. This assessment reached higher levels of Luftwaffe command, where it was largely dismissed. The prevailing belief remained that German engineering was superior and that American survival rates were due to fighter escort, tactical advantages, or sheer numbers overwhelming defenses. The alternative, that American design philosophy was fundamentally superior for strategic bombing operations, was too uncomfortable to accept. But individual German engineers were beginning to understand. Dr. Heinrich Hertel, an aeronautical engineer working for the Reich Air Ministry, obtained access to several crashed B-17 seconds in France during the late 1943. His detailed examination confirmed what frontline reports had been saying. The Americans had designed their bomber around an entirely different set of priorities. Hertel's report, classified but preserved, noted that American bombers sacrificed efficiency for survivability at every turn. Where German designers would use 3 structural members, Americans used 5. Where German fuel tanks were sized precisely for mission requirements, American tanks were oversized with multiple redundancies. Where German control systems used single cables or hydraulic lines, Americans used duplicates or triplicates. The weight penalty was significant. A B-17G weighed approximately 36,135 pounds empty, compared to roughly 17,650 pounds for a Ju-88. The American bomber carried nearly twice the structural weight, despite similar operational capabilities in some measures. But that extra structural weight translated directly into survivability. Hertel concluded his report with an observation that should have been obvious but was revolutionary in German military thinking. The Americans have correctly understood that crew survival and mission completion are more important than optimal aircraft performance. They accept reduced speed and ceiling in exchange for the ability to sustain damage. In a war of attrition, this is the superior philosophy. His recommendations for incorporating similar design philosophy into German bombers were filed away, unimplemented. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to retool production for new bomber designs. The war was being lost on multiple fronts. The Luftwaffe would have to fight with the aircraft it had, not the aircraft it needed. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots paralleled the experience of flak crews. Lieutenant Franz Stigler of Jagdgeschwader 27 encountered a heavily damaged B-17 on December 20, 1943, limping home alone after a raid on Bremen. The bomber had been savaged. The nose was shot away. The tail guns were destroyed. 2 engines were dead. The fuselage was riddled with holes. Wounded crew members were visible through the damage. Stigler pulled alongside the bomber, close enough to see the pilot struggling with the controls, close enough to see the terror and determination on the faces of the surviving crew. He had a clear shot. The bomber was defenseless. But something in that moment, seeing men fighting desperately to save their stricken aircraft, made Stigler hold his fire. He escorted the bomber to the coast, then saluted and broke away. Years later, Stigler would explain his decision. "I saw how hard they were fighting to survive. I saw their bomber continuing to fly despite damage that should have been impossible. I thought, these men have already been destroyed. Their aircraft is already dead. It just don't know it yet." But it kept flying. I couldn't bring myself to kill men in a flying coffin that refused to become a coffin. This incident, extraordinary as it was, revealed something about how even German pilots viewed the B-17. It had gained a reputation as an aircraft that should be dead but kept flying. This reputation affected German tactics, morale, and ultimately combat effectiveness. The ball turret, that distinctive sphere hanging from the B-17's belly, represented another example of thoughtful survivability design. The turret could be manually retracted if hydraulic power was lost, preventing the gunner from being trapped outside the aircraft. The gunner wore a chest pack parachute specifically because there was no room for a backpack in the confined space, but this meant he could bail out immediately if necessary. The turret's position, while vulnerable, allowed it to cover the bomber's most vulnerable approach angle while being positioned where battle damage would be least likely to compromise flight controls or critical systems. Even the oxygen system, often overlooked in discussions of aircraft survivability, showed careful design. The B-17 used multiple oxygen bottles distributed throughout the aircraft rather than a single large tank. This distribution meant that battle damage typically affected only a portion of the crew's oxygen supply. Crew members could share oxygen or move to areas with functioning systems. This saved lives on dozens of missions, where centralized oxygen systems would have caused crew incapacitation and aircraft loss. The armor protection, while not comprehensive, was strategically placed. The pilots had armor behind their seats. Critical components had armor shields, but the designers had understood that comprehensive armor would add prohibitive weight. Instead, they focused on protecting crew members in their most vulnerable positions and protecting systems that were difficult to make redundant, like the main spar attachment points. This selective approach to armor differed from German thinking, which tended toward either minimal armor or comprehensive protection. The American approach accepted that some areas would be vulnerable, while ensuring that likely hits on protected areas would be survivable. Combined with structural redundancy and system redundancy, this created overlapping layers of protection. By late 1944, German Flak effectiveness had reached a plateau. Despite improvements in fire control, better proximity fuses, and increased gun densities around critical targets, American bomber loss rates continued to decline. The combination of improved fighter escort, better tactics, and fundamentally survivable aircraft design was proving insurmountable. Oberst Heinrich Bodenschatz updated his earlier study in November 1944 with comprehensive data from the entire year. The numbers told a clear story. German air defenses were achieving hit rates of approximately 12 to 15% against American bomber formations. Of aircraft hit, approximately 8% were destroyed. This meant that overall loss rates from Flak were running at approximately 1% per mission. 1%. After expending millions of rounds of ammunition, after developing the finest anti-aircraft guns in the world, after training thousands of skilled gun crews, German Flak defenses were destroying one bomber out of every 100 that entered German airspace. The Americans could sustain these losses indefinitely. Germany could not sustain the cost of inflicting them. The industrial implications were staggering. Each 88mm shell cost approximately 20 Reichsmarks to produce and required scarce copper, steel, and explosives. At the current hit rate of approximately 1 hit per 18 shells fired, and with a kill rate of 1 in 12 hits, Germany was expending approximately 216 shells to destroy each American bomber. Those shells cost approximately 4,320 Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to the weekly wages of 40 skilled workers. Meanwhile, American factories were producing B-17 seconds at a rate of over 300 per month by mid-1944. Even accounting for losses to all causes, the American bomber fleet was growing faster than German defences could attrite it. The mathematics of attrition were brutally simple. American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than German defences could inflict them. Unteroffizier Ernst Becker, whose journey we began over Hamburg in July 1943, kept firing his 88mm gun through the end of 1944. His battery was eventually overrun by American ground forces in March 1945. In his final diary entry before capture, he wrote, "We have fired thousands of shells at their bombers. We have hit them hundreds of times. It makes no difference. They keep coming. Their aircraft refuse to die. We cannot win a war against machines that absorb our best weapons and continue functioning. The war is lost not because we lack courage or skill, but because they built aircraft we cannot destroy fast enough." This admission, from a veteran flak gunner who had fought from the beginning of the strategic bombing campaign to nearly the end of the war, captured the essential truth. The B-17's survivability wasn't a tactical advantage. It was a strategic weapon that made the entire American bombing campaign sustainable. The British, flying night missions, in their Lancasters and Halifaxes, suffered loss rates that often exceeded 5% per mission. These rates, while horrific, were accepted because the British had no alternative. They lacked long-range fighter escorts. They lacked the defensive armament for daylight operations. They had to bomb at night despite the reduced accuracy. The Americans initially faced similar or worse loss rates when they began operations in 1942. The famous Schweinfurt raids in August and October 1943 saw loss rates of nearly 20%, unsustainable by any measure. But by mid-1944, as fighter escort became available and tactics improved, American loss rates dropped below 3% per mission. The B-17's inherent survivability was the foundation that made this improvement possible. If American bombers had been as fragile as their German or British counterparts, the daylight bombing campaign would have been impossible. Loss rates would have remained unsustainably high even with fighter escort. The entire strategy of precision daylight bombing depended on having aircraft that could absorb battle damage and continue fighting. Boeing engineers, working in Seattle years before the first bombs fell on Germany, had made this strategy possible through systematic, careful design that prioritized survivability above all else. The final statistics of the air war tell the story clearly. The 8th Air Force flew approximately 350,000 bomber sorties against occupied Europe and Germany. They lost approximately 4,700 B-17 seconds to all causes. This represents a loss rate of approximately 1.3% per sortie. For every 100 B-17 seconds that entered hostile airspace, 98.7 returned to base. Many of those returning aircraft were heavily damaged, requiring extensive repair. But they returned. Their crews survived. They flew again. This sustainability, this ability to absorb punishment and continue operations, was the decisive factor that allowed the strategic bombing campaign to succeed. German forces, for all their skill and dedication, for all the sophistication of the 88mm gun and the courage of flak crews like Unteroffizier Becker's, could not overcome this fundamental advantage. They were fighting against an aircraft designed by engineers who understood that survivability was the precondition for all other performance characteristics. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.